Hello everyone, I welcome you all in today's lecture, and the topic of today's lecture is connections in steel structures. Our main focus in today's lecture will be on bolted connections. So in the case of steel structures, when two or more than two members are to be connected, we need connections. Actually, connections form an important part of any structure, and the connections are designed more conservatively than the members of the structure itself. This is because connections are more complex than the members to analyze. Further, in the case of overloading in a structure, we prefer that the failure is confined to an individual member rather than in the connections of the structure, which could otherwise affect many members in the structure. So if there is a failure of the joint or connection, the whole structure may get damaged or the whole structure is under threat. Also, the connections for steel structures account for more than half the cost of structural steel work. So the design and detailing of connections is of primary importance from the point of view of economy. Now the connections between various structural elements can be of the form beam and column connection, beam and beam connection, similarly column and column connection, column and bracket connection, or a truss member is connected through gusset plates, and the connections between purlins and rafters. So as you can see in the figure, this is a connection between a beam and a beam. This beam is connected to another beam. So this is the cross section of one beam, and this is the longitudinal section of the beam in transverse direction. So these beams are connected to each other. Similarly, we have a column connected to a beam. This is actually an I section column. This is the thickness of the flange, is the web, and this is the I section beam which is connected to the flange of the column. Similarly, we have a truss joint or truss connection in which different members of the truss are connected by way of gusset plate. This plate is called a gusset plate, and the members of the truss have been connected through the gusset plate. Now these different members can be connected to each other through fasteners or connectors, and the different types of connectors are rivets, bolts, and welds, and the connections produced due to these fasteners are called rivet connections when rivets are involved in the connection, bolted connections when the connection is made by bolting the structural elements, or welded connections when different structural elements are connected by way of welding. So in case of rivet connections, rivets are used to connect different structural steel elements. A rivet is actually made up of a round ductile steel bar which has a shank and a head at other end. So this is the shape of a rivet. This is called a snap head. This is called head of the rivet. This is called shank of the rivet, and this shape of the rivet is called snap head rivet. Similarly, we have flat head rivet. The shape of the head is like this, and we have the shank of circular diameter, rather circular section. So we have D equal to nominal diameter, and in this case we have D equal to nominal diameter. And in case of snap head, we have the diameter equal to 1.6 times the nominal diameter, and the height or thickness of the head as 0.7 times D. Similarly, in this case we have this dimension of the rivet head as 2D, and thickness of the rivet head as 0.25 D. The rivet is designated by the diameter of its shank. That is, the designation of the rivet is given by specifying the diameter of the shank. And the diameter of the shank of a rivet is called nominal diameter. But this nominal diameter is the diameter of the shank of a rivet in unheated condition. So we have a joint here. This is called lap joint. That is, we have two plates connected by a rivet or a rivet line, and this distance is called grip length. That is, it is actually the total thickness of the two plates which are being connected. So this is the head of the rivet. This is the portion of the rivet or of the shank which has been hammered to the shape of a snap head. So in the case of riveting, holes are drilled or punched in the plates to be connected. The size of holes are 1.5 mm larger than the size of the rivet, up to the diameter of the rivet of 25 mm. And for rivets of diameter more than 25 mm, the diameter of the holes to be punched through the plates should be 2 mm larger than the diameter of the rivets. So for riveting, a rivet is heated uniformly to light red color and then place it in the hole provided in the plates or structural steel members to be connected. The head of the rivet is kept pressed on the plate, and the other side, that is shank, is hammered to form another head on the other side of the plate. So on cooling, the rivet contracts and grips the plates together tightly. Now, rivets may be driven by hydraulic power or pneumatic power. So the rivets are classified according to the method of driving as power driven rivets and hand driven rivets. And in case of power driven rivets, we have power driven shop rivets, in which case the rivets are driven in fabrication shop, and power driven field rivets, which are power driven at site. And then we have the hand driven rivets, which are actually driven with the help of manual labor. Now, riveted connections were once very popular, but these are actually obsolete nowadays. They have been replaced by bolted connections. This is due to the fact of low strength of rivets. Because of the low strength of the rivets, large number of holes need to be punctured in the plates to be connected. So the net cross-sectional area of the plates gets reduced. As a result, the strength of the joint as a whole gets reduced. Similarly, we have higher installation costs in case of rivets. There is also the necessity of preheating the rivets prior to driving. That is one of the disadvantages. Also, high level of noise is produced during riveting process, which is very undesirable. Skilled labor is necessary for inspection of rivet connections, and there is also a very high labor cost involved in case of riveted connections. In case of bolted connections, a bolt and nut is used to join different members of a steel structure. And bolt has a head at one end and a shank threaded at the other end. As you can see in the figure, this is the bolt with hexagonal head, and this is the side view of the head of the bolt. The distance between the washers is called grip length, and the distance from the underside of the washer up to the extreme position of the bolt is called bolt length. So we have a nut which is tightened to grip or to clamp the plates together, and this portion is called threaded portion. We have washers, hard steel washers placed at the location of head and at the location of the nut. Now, steel washers are usually provided under the bolt as well as under the nut to serve two purposes. Number one, to distribute the clamping pressure on the bolted members. Number two, to prevent the threaded portion of the bolt from bearing on the connecting members. Now, classification of the bolted connections. Bolted connections are classified based on the type of the resultant force transferred. The bolted connections are referred to as concentric connections when the load passes through the center of gravity of the section. For example, axially loaded tension and compression members. In ideal concentric connections, we should have only one bolt passing through all the members meeting at a point, as shown in figure A. But this is practically very tough. So in practice, this is not usually possible. So it is only ensured that the centroidal axes of the members meet at one point. As you can see from the figure B, this is the centroidal axis of this member, this is the centroidal axis of this member, and we have the central axis of this member meeting at one point. So we can connect these members through a cassette plate to make a connection. Similarly, we have eccentric connections, that is when the load is away from the CG of the connection. That is, for example, we have the reaction transferred from the brackets to the column. As you can see, this is the eccentric connection, this is also the eccentric connection, because the CG of the load is away from the CG of the joint. Similarly, we have moment resisting connections, that is beam to column connections in pyramid structures are generally moment resisting connections. The connection shown in figure 2a is often found in moment resisting frames, where the beam moment is transferred to the column. That is figure A. This is a moment resisting connection. This is also a moment resisting connection, and further they are eccentric connections as well. So the connection is also used at the base of column, where a base plate is connected to the foundation by means of a anchor bolt. In this connection, the bolts are subjected to combination of shear and axial tension. For example, we have a column and it is connected to the base plate, and these are the connections between the angles at the base, and these are the connections between the base plate and the column. Also we have the foundation bolts into the concrete. So this connection is also moment resisting connection. Now we have another classification of the bolt. Bolt is based on type of force experienced by the bolts. So the bolted connections can also be classified based on geometry and load conditions into three types, namely shear connections, tension connections, and combined shear and tension connection. Typical shear connections occur as lap joint and butt joint, which are generally used in tension members. So this is the lap joint. It's one member is placed on the another member, and these very members are joined by bolts or rivets or any other fastener. It's called a lap joint or lap connection. In this connection, when the load is applied along the axis of this member and the load is applied along the axis of this member, this load finally gets transferred to the bolt, and in other words, there is a force in this direction and a force in this direction on the bolt. So this section of the bolt, that is, this is the plane of shear, there will be two forces in this direction and in this direction. So there will be shear developed at this location. Similarly, there will be shear at this location. So these are called shear connectors as well. Similarly, this is a single cover butt joint, that is, the two structural elements or two plates are facing each other and they are covered or connected by a cover plate, and these are finally joined by the bolts or any other fastener. So this is called a single cover butt joint. The bolts in this case are also subject to shear. Similarly, this is also a double cover butt joint, that is the two members are facing each other and these have been connected by two plates, one on top and another on bottom, and then we have placed the bolts and we call it as double cover butt joint. So the bolt in this location or in this joint is subjected to shear at two locations, that is we have shear developed at this plane and shear developed at this plane, so we call it as double shear, and in this case we call it as single shear. Now we have another classification based on force transfer mechanism by bolts. The bolted connections are classified as bearing type, in which case bolts bear against the vertical faces of the holes to transfer the force. That is, for example, this is the hole, this is the rivet head or bolt head. This is the force in this member and this is the force in this member. So when the force is subjected to this member, this force gets transferred to the bolt and the bolt pushes against the vertical face of this hole. This is called bolts bear against the vertical face of the hole to transfer force, and by way of this mechanism the force gets transferred to the from the plate to the this bolt. We have another type that's called friction type. In this case, force transfer between the plates or connected members is due to clamping force generated by the pre-tensioning of the bolts. That is, when these bolts are clamped, that is when the nut on the other side of the bolt is tightened, there gets development of pre-tension in the bolt, and as a result of which the two a force gets in a vertical direction gets transferred to the plates of the to the two connecting members, and as a result a frictional force is developed between the plates. So by way of that frictional force developed in the plates, the force transmission takes place. And in bearing type connections, the plates are in firm contact, but they may slip under loading until the inner surface of the holes bear against the bolt. So the load transmitted from plate to the bolt is therefore by bearing, and the bolt is in shear in this case. Whereas in case of friction type, the force gets transmitted or transferred through friction between the plates, and the bolt in this case is not under shear. So this is all for today. Thank you.